Trump, the MS13 argument. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. Donald Trump is an upper lesser type B narcissist. He is President of the United States. He, like many famous individuals, provides me with an opportunity to demonstrate various facets of the narcissistic dynamic while also explaining why he behaves in the way that he does. I'm going to be analysing a piece of video footage shortly, which arose from an interview that took place between President Trump and Terry Moran of ABC News following Trump's first 100 days in office of his second term. A number of matters were discussed in that interview, but one item which has received particular attention relates to the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who is a Salvadorian man living in Maryland who was then deported despite the presence of a protective court order. In the course of the interview, Terry Moran pointed out that the Supreme Court had ordered Garcia's return to the United States and suggested that President Trump had the power to comply by making a single phone call. This caused Trump to bristle. "I could," Trump said, but added, "I'm not the one making this decision. We have lawyers that don't want to do this." "You're the president," Moran said. Then, after they talked over each other, Trump said, No. I follow the law. You want me to follow the law. If I were the president and just wanted to do anything, I'd probably keep him right where he is." The Supreme Court says what the law is, Moran pointed out. Thus, there was already an exchange in relation to this individual, but it took an interesting turn surrounding the suggestion that Garcia has MS13 tattoos on his knuckles. Let's have a look at the footage taken from the interview, and then I'll provide more background for those of you who might not be familiar with what's going on, and then analyse the nature of the exchange, which demonstrates how Trump's narcissism causes him to behave the way that he does. Here's the footage.
First error that was made by a very incompetent man, a man that turned out to be incompetent, that you always said was wonderful, great genius, right? And now you find out, all of the media now, they're saying what a mistake they made. A man who was grossly incompetent allowed us to have open borders where millions of people flowed in. I campaigned on that issue. I wouldn't say it was my number one issue, but it was pretty close.
Right up there.
I campaigned on that issue. I've done an amazing job. I have closed borders. He said you couldn't do it. You wouldn't be able to do it. It would never happen. Well, it happened, and it happened very quickly. Wait a minute. When we have criminals, murderers, criminals in this country, we have to get them out, and we're doing it.
By law.
And you'll pick out one man, but even the man that you picked out, he said he wasn't a member of a gang. And then they looked, and on his knuckles, he had MS-13.
There's a dispute
Well,
over that.
wait a minute. He had MS-13 on his knuckles tattooed.
Oh, he had some tattoos that are interpreted that way. But let's move on.
Wait a minute. Hey, Terry.
He did not have the
do that.
letter MS13.
It says MS13.
That was Photoshop. So let me
That was Photoshop. Terry, you can't
had-
do that. Hey, they're giving you the big break of a lifetime. You know, you're doing the interview. I picked you because, frankly, I never heard of you, but that's okay. But I picked you, Terry, but you're not being very nice. He had MS-13 tattooed.
We'll agree to disagree. I want to move on to something else.
Terry, do you want me to show you the picture?
I saw the picture. We'll
and you think it
agree
was
to disagree.
Photoshop? Well,
Here we go.
Don't Photoshop it. Go look at his hand. He
Fair
had
enough.
MS-13.
He did have tattoos that can be interpreted that way. I'm not an expert on them. I want to turn to Ukraine,
No,
sir.
Terry,
I want to get to Ukraine.
No. He had MS as clear as you can be, not interpreted. This is why people no longer believe the news, because
when
it's
he was
fake
photographed
news.
in El Salvador, they aren't there. But let's just go on. They aren't there when he's in El Salvador.
They weren't there, but they're there now, right?
No,
but they're there
in
now.
your picture.
Terry,
Ukraine, sir.
he's got MS-13 on his knuckles.
All right.
Okay?
All right. We'll take a look at that.
You do
We'll take
such
a
a
look.
disservice.
We'll take a look at
Why
that,
don't you
sir.
just say, yes, he does, and, go on to something else?
It's contested. Ukraine.
Okay, before we get into the analysis, we need some context because that will assist with the analysis. So the starting point is to understand that back on April the 18th, Donald Trump shared a picture, and he did so on X and Truth Social. In the photo, Trump is holding a piece of paper featuring a separate picture showing the tattoos across Abrego Garcia's hand. Trump wrote, "This is the hand of the man that the Democrats feel should be brought back to the United States because he is such a fine and innocent person. They said he is not a member of MS13, even though he's got MS13 tattooed onto his knuckles. And 2 highly respected courts found that he was a member of MS13, beat up his wife, etc. I was elected to take bad people out of the United States, among other things. I must be allowed to do my job, make America great again." Now, research around this post demonstrates that it's genuine, meaning there was a photograph taken of Donald Trump, and in that photograph, he is holding up another photograph of Garcia's hand. And Garcia's hand has 4 tattoos across his fingers: a marijuana leaf, a smiley face with 2 X's for the eyes, a crucifix, and a skull. Above those tattoos appears MS13. Now, what is clear from the research surrounding this and from other pictures that have been obtained in respect of Garcia's hand is that he does indeed have the 4 symbols, the marijuana leaf, the smiley face, the cross, and the skull on his fingers, but he doesn't have the letters and numbers MS13 tattooed on his knuckles. It would appear that somebody has added those, presumably as an interpretative aid, because it's understood that the marijuana leaf, etc., means MS13. And so somebody's superimposed those onto the pictures to aid understanding. Accordingly, Trump's picture is authentic. He's showing Garcia's hand. The hand does have the tattoos on it, and that picture has the letters MS13 on it also. Now, as mentioned, the symbol tattoos do exist. 2 separate photos exist in USA Today stories. One came from El Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele's social media, and the other one was credited to CASA. And they show the knuckle tattoos, although the skull and cross were visible only in one of them. It would appear, however, that he doesn't have MS13 actually tattooed on his knuckles, and there is the suggestion that the tattoos don't actually mean MS13, but I suspect there is an argument about that some people interpret those symbols as meaning MS13, whereas others do not. But the facts are, Trump was holding up a photograph, that's him. The photograph does show Garcia's hand. Garcia does have the symbols on his fingers, and MS13 has been superimposed onto that photograph, presumably as an interpretive aid. Garcia does not have the tattoos MS13 actually written as MS13 on his knuckles. He may have symbols that can be interpreted to mean that. So that's the context. So that's important for that to be made clear. Now, as you've watched in the footage, Donald Trump is insistent that MS13 appeared on his knuckles. Now, he might mean the symbols show MS13 and that's what's tattooed. Or he might genuinely believe that the letters and numbers MS13 were present. Terry Moran sought to explain that MS13 did not appear as symbols and letters on his knuckles. That was as a result of a Photoshop. Although the use of Photoshop often has connotations that it's done to mislead, I think it would have been better to describe it as superimposed for the purposes of interpretation. And that results in the argument that takes place between the two individuals. Now, let's analyse what's going on there. At the start of the clip, Trump is referencing his predecessor, Biden's failures with regard to border control. He is therefore criticising Biden. Whether you think such criticism is legitimate or not is irrelevant. That is what he is doing. And in so doing, he is triangulating the interviewer with Biden in order to control Moran, the interviewer, and he's also indirectly asserting control over Biden by highlighting his incompetence. This is driven by his narcissism because, as you know, everything that the narcissist does when interacting with another person is driven by the narcissist's pursuit of the prime aims. Trump demonstrates his grandiosity by talking about the fact that he's done an amazing job. He self-congratulates himself, which is typical narcissistic behaviour. You might think to yourself, he's right to congratulate himself. You may not, but irrespective of what your view is, what he's doing is self-congratulating himself, which is an embodiment of grandiosity that one sees with a narcissist. Moran attempts to interrupt Trump, which is a threat to his control. He tells him to wait a minute. And he goes on to talk about how he's wanting to get bad people out of the United States, and then references Garcia by saying, "You selected one man." And Trump then points out that he's had tattooed on his knuckles MS13. Moran seeks to interrupt him by pointing out that that wasn't actually correct. Moran points out correctly he didn't have MS13 actually tattooed on his hand, and acknowledges that it could be interpreted, the symbols, the marijuana leaf, etc., could be interpreted as MS13. This threatens Trump's need for control because it's saying that he's wrong. Trump responds, he struggles to say the word interpreted in his response, but is insistent that the letters and numbers MS13 were tattooed on the hand of Garcia. Now, at this point, Trump is either telling a lie in that he knew that it was superimposed, but is claiming that those letters and numbers have been tattooed on the fingers, or, and I think this is more likely, he mistakenly believes from the picture that he saw that the letter and numbers were tattooed, that somebody else, I don't suggest Donald Trump's done this, that somebody else has superimposed them and he has mistakenly read it as, or looked at the picture and thought that he's got both symbols and the numbers and letters tattooed. And therefore, when he is saying he, Garcia, had MS13 spelled across the knuckles, Trump isn't creating an alternative truth here. It is actually an honest belief, even though he is mistaken. Thus, that is the point that he is asserting. Moran suggests that it was photoshopped, and in so doing, that implicitly suggests that Donald Trump is wrong. Trump believes that he is right, because he, even though he may be mistaken, recalls seeing a photograph which had MS13 shown on the hand of Garcia. Now, whether a narcissist is using the truth as everybody else understands it to be, or the truth as they interpret it to be through the lens of their narcissism, in effect, the outcome is the same. When you tell the narcissist that they are wrong, either because the narcissist is lying or the narcissist is mistaken, you're threatening the narcissist's need for control. So in a sense, it's actually irrelevant what Donald Trump's source of belief is for the letters. Either he is telling a lie in that he knows that that was not actually tattooed on the fingers, but maintains it was. Or, and I think this is far more likely, he simply made a mistake and thinks it was tattooed on there when it was not, but it is an honest mistake that he is making. Either way, the effect is the same. That is his position. And Moran, suggesting that it's photoshopped, suggests that there's something untoward in what Trump's doing. Now, many of you would think to yourself, well, if I had an honest belief in it and someone was telling me that I was wrong, I think I would be offended too, quite possibly. But it would be unlikely that you would continue to respond in the way that Donald Trump does. Because after Moran tells him that this is photoshopped, Trump goes on the attack. He then starts to belittle Moran by saying, you've got the big break of a lifetime in interviewing me. He then insults him by saying, frankly, I've never heard of you, and then goes on in a way to contradict himself, but I still chose you. Well, if you hadn't heard of him, how could you choose him? Or perhaps he means, I was given a selection of names, I had no idea who he was, but I chose you anyway, which seems a rather strange way of doing it. But the point is that Trump has moved away from the insistence that he is correct about the tattoos showing MS13. He's now denigrating the interviewer by belittling him, by suggesting that he's got the big break down to Donald Trump, that he never heard of him, and suggesting that he's only being heard of because of Donald Trump exhibiting his grandiosity. Trump goes on to state, you're not being very nice, which is part of the victim mentality of Trump coming forward. Now, as an upper lesser type B, he is not somebody that will exhibit a victim mentality to, say, the same extent that a mid-range narcissist would do so. But it's still there, and here it comes out a little bit with him saying, you're not being very nice. Trump then reverts to his insistence that MS13 was tattooed. Moran, sensing that he's not getting anywhere, will say, well, let's agree to disagree, we'll move on to something else, which would appear that he's ceding control to Trump. But it isn't satisfactory to Trump, because he wants to be proved right. He doesn't want it to be dismissed by saying, oh, we'll agree to disagree, let's move on to something else. He wants Moran to admit that Trump is right and he is wrong. Trump remains insistent. He's stating, do you want me to show you the photograph? Because he honestly believes that he does have MS13 tattooed on his fingers. He is suggesting that he would show it to Moran. Moran concedes that he had tattoos on his hand, but they weren't MS13, and says they could be interpreted as MS13. There's a dispute about that. I'm not an expert. So again, it looks like he's conceding, and he then wants to move on to talking about Ukraine. But again, this doesn't satisfy Donald Trump. The fact that Moran looks like he's deflecting from it by saying, let's just move on, it could be interpreted this way. But Trump wants final victory. He wants him to concede that Trump is right, because Trump's thinking, I've seen this photograph. I know that it says MS13 on it. Why are you saying that it doesn't? Now, many of you would think, well, that does seem fair enough. If he knows what he's seen and this person's denying it, no wonder he's reacting in the way that he does. But it goes further than that. It's not just an affront at believing that you've seen something and he's got it wrong, but it relates to the issue of control, that it is a visceral assault upon Donald Trump, in effect, by maintaining a denial that Trump is correct when Trump knows that he is. And remember, whether he's using the truth as what everybody else understands it to be, or his own truth seen through his narcissistic lens, Donald Trump is always right and is always correct. And if you disagree with him, you're wrong. And that translates to it being a threat to control. Trump then becomes indignant, stating, no, 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 no. He had MS, clear as you like. Trump states this is because nobody believes the news anymore. And of course, this segues very neatly into demonstrating the prevailing mindset of Donald Trump, whereby he regularly calls out the news as fake news because it doesn't accord with his world view. Now, this instance is quite interesting because on other occasions, when Donald Trump has talked about the truth, it has been seen to be an invention caused by his narcissism rather than the truth as is universally understood by other people. Here, I do not believe that he's telling a lie. I believe that he's operating under a mistaken belief that the fingers did have MS13 on it because he saw that in the photograph and didn't distinguish between the printed letters and the actual symbol tattoos. He thought that they were all tattoos. So he's not telling a lie, he's mistaken. But the fact is that whether he is telling his truth, a lie, or the truth as universally understood by anybody else, the failure to accord with what he sees is a threat to control and then translates into his overall paranoia of news outlets, as he's describing here, as he talks about how this is why people don't trust the news. You hear an exasperated sigh from Moran at this point, which is not going to benefit Trump any further other than the provision of fuel. Throughout this whole exchange, Moran is providing challenge fuel because he's reacting to Donald Trump, but because he's not agreeing with him and he's questioning his recall of events and suggesting that MS13 was not tattooed there. All of this amounts to a threat to Donald Trump's need for control. Trump's frustration starts to spill over. There was a slight discussion about the fact that the symbols weren't there in El Salvador, but Trump says they're here now. Moran says, no, they're not here now. And then Trump expresses his disdain by saying, you're doing such a disservice. Why don't you just admit? Why don't you just say yes in respect of admitting that I'm right and you're wrong? Moran again looks to move matters onto Ukraine, and it cuts from the interview at that point. Now, what is interesting about this, as I mentioned, is the fact that Donald Trump, to my mind, is operating under a mistaken belief. Nevertheless, anybody that counters that mistaken belief is amounting to a threat to control. And you see the various manipulations that his narcissism uses: repetition, insistence, invalidation, belittlement, triangulation, and how Trump keeps going. You might think that in certain instances, control is being given by Moran when he says, okay, we'll agree to disagree. Okay, it's an interpretation. I'm not an expert. Okay, let's move on. But that doesn't give Trump the satisfaction. What this also demonstrates is how Trump is such a divisive figure and how some people would look on this interview and say, he's got it wrong. Look at him, he's telling lies. As I said, I don't believe that he actually is. Others might say, okay, he's misunderstood and he's got it wrong, but he has to keep going and going and going. He's like a dog with a bone. It's not particularly statesmanlike, throwing in these insults about you've got the big break and I've never heard of you. That's not particularly polished. And therefore, his critics are likely to view him that way. But also, other people will say, well, this is why I like Donald Trump. He won't let go. He is like a dog with a bone. He believes that he's right. Yes, he might be labouring under a mistake in this instance, or some people will believe that Trump is entirely correct. But the point is, they are drawn to him because he doesn't back down, because he won't be cowed in the face of hostility or being questioned. And thus, you see, what's interesting about his narcissism is that it is a complete turn-off for some people, and it's a huge attracting factor for others. He's become the President of the United States following an election, and that demonstrates that his behaviours resonate and appeal to many voters. And as you know, because he's a narcissist, the behaviours that he's exhibiting here are driven by his narcissism, his insistence that he is right, the pursuit of an admission, the need for total victory, that he needs his opponent to basically say, I'm wrong, you're right. That he keeps going and going, even when it looks like he's been handed control by Moran. Trump keeps going. And that dogged determination, driven by his narcissism, is evidently an attractor for certain people who are his supporters. A very interesting analysis, once again, that Donald Trump provides, showing his narcissism in action. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for watching.